The sky was still gray when Elijah Monroe crossed the automatic doors of the city's largest airport. He carried an old backpack on his back, worn out by time, and on his feet a pair of boots that had traveled too many roads to be impressed by, red carpets. He walked slowly with the kind of presence that doesn't need to draw attention to be noticed. He had something in his eyes, a quiet firmness, as if carrying more stories than words. No expensive watch, no Italian blazer, no black guard. Just a black man with long braids and thick hands of someone who has worked his whole life without making noise. The airport lounge was cold, modern, full of glitz and pretension. Sophisticated suitcases glided over the polished marble, anxious. Voices mingling with the boarding calls. There was haste, luxury, distraction. And in the midst of that scenario of status disguised as efficiency, Elijah seemed out of place. Not by himself, but by the eyes of others. A security guard from a distance watched him suspiciously. An attendant behind the counter hesitated for a second before resuming her rehearsed smile. To them, he was just another misplaced gentleman, but they were about to find out that the mistake wasn't his. Elijah was not there by chance. That trip was not about tourism or business. It was a silent choice. He decided to fly incognito with an old civilian name, to test his own airline service culture in practice. It was something I did every 2 years without telling anyone. No suit, no badge, no advisors. Just him, his ticket, bought anonymously, and the watchful eye of someone who knows the backstage like no one else. He believed that the true quality of a service only appears when the customer does not seem important. As she walked to the check-in counters, she noticed something she had already expected, the difference in her eyes. The attendants laughed among themselves, but the laughter ceased when he approached. He introduced himself, held out the note, and saw the employee's hesitant fingers touch the paper as if something was wrong. She confirmed the data in the system, in a hurry without looking her in the eye. He typed, sighed, and finally printed the boarding pass with a hurried gesture. There was no "Welcome, Mr. Monroe," just a hand movement that indicated the direction of security. Elijah took the paper and followed. That was already answer enough. In the security line, more looks. An agent asked to search his backpack more rigorously than the other passengers. Another looked at his ID twice. Elijah remained silent. He had seen it before, hundreds of times at gas stations, in the yards of companies that he himself saved from bankruptcy. Being black, simple, and invisible was almost always a complete package. But he was there not as a billionaire, not as an executive. He was a common passenger, and what was he about to discover? It was what thousands of others were already experiencing daily. As he passed through the gates, he saw the bright sign with gold letters, "First Class Exclusive Lounge." That didn't intimidate him. On the contrary, it was one of the areas he valued most in the company's original project. He had created that space so that everyone who was there would be treated with kindness and comfort. When he entered, however, he noticed the different cold in the environment. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was the environment filtering. His presence. The waiter serving champagne dodged. The receptionist looked twice at the card, as if trying to find an error. Elijah smiled inside. The test had already begun. He sat in a corner watching the movement. She looked at the details of the lounge, the decorative paintings, the soft lighting, the forced smiles. But what he really saw, it was the contrast, how welcoming a place can seem, until someone outside the mold decides to occupy it. Elijah took a small notebook from his backpack, opened it to the blank page and wrote a single sentence. First class begins with the look. Little did he know that on that very day, the look that judged him, it would be stamped in the headlines of the entire country. And as he got up to board, ticket in hand, the world prepared to watch a scene no one would ever forget. The company's check-in counter was clean, with lighting strategically planned to enhance the uniforms and smiles of the attendants. Everything there was designed to feel welcoming, but Elijah felt the first chill before he even opened his mouth. He stood for a few seconds in front of the counter, waiting to be noticed. The employee, a young woman with good makeup, pretended, to be finishing something on the computer. She saw him. He knew he did. But it took a few seconds before she lifted her face, and when she did, she came with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elijah held out his document with the printed note. The name used was an old one, registered even before he founded the company. Part of the disguise. The attendant picked up the paper with slow fingers, as if she didn't want to touch it too much. His eyes ran up and down him, making that typical sweep of someone who judges before serving. He typed something into the system, frowned, and gave a sideways glance to his colleague at the next counter, who also gave a complicit look. The discomfort was no longer subtle. It was palpable. But Elijah remained silent. He watched her, and he wrote everything down, not with a pen, but with the memory of someone who had learned to transform contempt into structure. The employee snorted softly, thinking he wouldn't hear. She confirmed the data and held out the passage to him with a half-trembling hand, as if the paper might explode. He didn't wish him a good trip. He offered no help. He didn't ask if he knew where the gate was. He just returned it with a mechanical and impatient movement. Elijah picked up his boarding pass as calmly as always, but inside he felt a familiar echo, that of silent indignation. The same one that grew when someone treated him as invisible, within something that he himself built. As he walked away from the counter, he heard the phrase that he was not supposed to hear. The attendant whispered something to her colleague. "First class has now become a mess, right?" Elijah paused for a second. He looked away but said nothing, because sometimes silence educates more than an answer, and he wanted to see how far that line of disrespect could go, not out of pride but out of duty, because if that happened, to him, what would it be like with any stranger? Without resources, without power, without camera, without name. In the security line, the situation has not improved. The search agent searched Elijah more rigorously than the others. He asked to open his backpack, felt the inside pockets, passed the metal detector more than once. All this while, other passengers passed by with laptops and perfumes intact. Elijah again remained serene. But each gesture, each mistrust for no reason, was one more brick in the construction of the story to come. The security guard's eyes said, "You don't look trustworthy." But Elijah's response was an upright, unwavering posture. As he crossed the last gates, he held his boarding pass as if holding a key, with respect. He knew that the next moment would reveal the real test. Because if at check-in he was ignored, at the entrance of the aircraft would be challenged. There was no doubt about that. The way people looked at him said it all. He was about to try to access a place where, in the minds of many, he didn't belong. The problem? That was the first class of the company he founded, and as he approaches the preferential line with the ticket in hand and eyes attentive to his walk, Elijah didn't know that the worst was yet to come, but the whole world would soon know. The first-class line moved slowly, flanked by a red carpet and selective looks. Passengers lined up in expensive suits, fine dresses, and imported perfumes, chatted in whispers, as if the space itself demanded silence and distinction. Elijah approached with firm but not hurried steps, the boarding pass in hand, the serene look and the posture of someone who does not bow down. When he arrived at the entrance, he calmly held out the note to the flight attendant in charge of the screening. But what he received back was not a welcome. It was a long, uncomfortable, judgmental pause. The woman looked at the note, then looked at it. He frowned, narrowed his eyes, as if looking for an error. Not in the system, but in the person, in front of him. He typed something into the terminal, looked at the watch, then back to it. Elijah remained motionless, watching, patiently. Behind him, the line grew. Some people were already whispering. A man in a suit commented something, on the phone, without disguising his tone of disdain. The flight attendant sighed loudly, as if she were about to deal with a fraud. And then, the absurdity happened. She called a supervisor. The supervisor came with a fast walk, tight blazer, and an expression of impatience. He took the note from the flight attendant's hands, quickly analyzed it, and then stared Elijah up. and down. "This note is out of standard," he muttered, as if that justified what he would do next. Without questioning, without investigating thoroughly, he tore the note in half as if eliminating a problem. The gesture was dry, cruel, and symbolic. The first class was not for that kind of person, at least not in the minds of those who saw only appearance. And in that instant, Elijah's blood boiled inside. But his posture didn't change. The flight attendant pointed to the bottom of the aircraft, as if getting rid of a nuisance. Elijah was demoted to economic class right there, without plausible explanations, without the slightest consideration. The looks around multiplied. Some passengers pretended not to see, others filmed discreetly, and many smiled, as if they had witnessed a necessary adjustment. Elijah walked down the aisle without saying a word, but each step seemed to weigh more than a ton. The first-class cabin watched him leave with relief. Little did they know that they were watching the beginning of the end, of the mask that everyone there wore. As he sat down in economy class, Elijah looked at the small torn boarding pass he still held, as if looking at a scar. It was not just a paper. It was material proof of something much greater. Institutionalized, contempt, systematic prejudice, judgment based on appearance. Everything he fought to fight in his company. He was still there, alive, in the corridors that he himself helped to draw. And that hurt. It hurt more than any bumpy road or restless journey. Because now it was personal. Meanwhile, the flight attendant and supervisor returned to the entrance as if nothing had happened. They laughed among themselves. First class followed their ritual of imported coffee and hot towels. But in the back of the plane, a young university student who observed everything decided to record a video. He captured the scene, the injustice, and posted it with a simple caption. He had the right ticket. It just didn't look right. No one there knew, but at that very moment, the first sign of justice began to gain wings. And as the plane gained altitude, an unassuming video began to descend, right into the heart of the internet. The discreet vibration on the young student's cell phone was confirmation that the video was online. He had published it a few minutes after takeoff, without any great expectations. He just wanted to show the world an injustice he couldn't swallow. The video was simple. It showed the exact moment Elijah's note was torn up, the flight attendant's cold expression, and the slow walk of a man who just wanted to take the place that was rightfully his. The caption was short but accurate. When appearance is worth more than truth. It didn't take long for the post to start gaining traction. First came friends, then followers of anti-racism profiles, and, in less than an hour, influencers started sharing. The video was reposted on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and even aviation forums. The comments ranged from revolt to indignation, but one phrase was repeated: "This man needs justice." No one knew who Elijah was yet. To the public, he was just a wronged old man, treated as an intruder by an elitist team. And perhaps that was the most symbolic thing. He represented everyone who had ever been expelled from a place that was also theirs. In a distant cafe, someone recognized the face. A former employee of the company who had already seen Elijah at internal events left a pinned comment that burst the bubble. "Guys, that's the founder of the company, the owner, Elijah Monroe. I worked there." Within minutes, the focus of the story had completely changed. The narrative gained an extra layer. The humiliated man was not an ordinary passenger. He was the creator of the very system that rejected him. The internet has gone into turmoil, and the name Elijah began to rise like a missile in all trending topics. News sites picked up the case. Headlines began to pop. Airline founder demoted to economy class by his own staff. In parallel, editors began to cut old excerpts from rare interviews with Elijah, where he talked about respect, inclusion, and equality in the aviation sector. The contrast was shocking. The man who preached empathy, he had been a victim of what he had always fought. The public did not forgive, and the video, now with millions of views, began to reach the ears that really mattered, those of the airline's board of directors. Inside the plane, the weather began to change without the crew realizing why. Some passengers who had filmed the humiliation looked discreetly at Elijah, now with eyes full of doubt and restrained respect. The young man who published the video felt his cell phone vibrate uninterruptedly. I knew I had caused something, but I still didn't know the dimension of the impact. In seat 17B, Elijah remained silent. His cell phone was turned off. He didn't yet know that the outside world already knew who he was, but he felt it, on the chest, that something was changing. In the cabin, the captain received a coded message from the central office. It was short, to the point, and urgent. Confirm immediately. Is Elijah Monroe on board? The pilot frowned, checked the internal registers, and felt his heart race. I knew that name carried weight. Institutional weight, political, moral. When he confirmed, he received another message afterwards. Aircraft under special protocol. When you land, wait for instructions. Don't let the team know. The captain understood. A silent storm was approaching, and the moment the aircraft cut through the clouds in absolute silence, the reputation of an entire company plummeted in. Free fall on social networks, but no one in the front cockpit knew yet that they were about to serve coffee to the man who was now making headlines around the world. The video was already viral, but the internet still treated it as one example among so many, until the truth came like thunder. A verified profile, with a photo of a man in a hat, dark skin, and a restrained smile, left a comment that silenced the entire section. Thank you for filming. I am the owner of the company. I'm seeing everything. The name, Elijah Monroe. 3 words, but enough to change the weight of the narrative. The thousands of likes were replaced by a momentary silence. The audience retreated for a second, before exploding with indignation. Within minutes, official profiles began to react. Journalists checked and confirmed. Elijah really was the founder of the company. The truck driver who started out transporting interstate cargo, who slept in the ride and dreamed of wings, now owned the largest airline in the country. And on that flight, he was judged and humiliated by his own creation. Not because of incompetence, but because of prejudice. The video made international headlines. In several languages, a single message was repeated. They tore up the owner's own note. As the story spread, the crew's behavior had not yet changed. Elijah remained ignored, treated like any other non-standard passenger. The supervisor who tore up his note laughed in the background with the chief stewardess, exchanging inside jokes. Little did they know that they were stamping the screens of millions of cell phones around the planet. Every laugh of theirs now had a caption. Every gesture as a public judgment. The networks did not forgive, and the comments turned into a digital court. If they treat the owner like this, imagine who has no power. Inside the company, chaos was already beginning to set in. Directors received calls from executives, shareholders demanded answers, and legal departments rushed to understand the risks. The name Elijah was everywhere. Websites, radio, morning shows. But he didn't say anything else. His silence, calm, solid, intact, spoke louder than any public statement. And that was what scared those involved the most. Because a man who doesn't need to raise his voice, it is the one that carries the most dangerous power of all, that of truth. In the cockpit of the plane, the captain now knew everything. He confirmed with the tower that measures were being taken. A group of executives was already waiting for him at the landing, and a request: keep the crew oblivious until the time of landing. The recommendation was clear: not to cause more tension, not to warn the guilty, but to make sure that Elijah was the first to get off the aircraft, and that all eyes were prepared for what was to come next. The flight was now more than a transport. It was a countdown to live justice. Meanwhile, Elijah remained where he was, sitting, quiet, watching the window. Eyes fixed on the sky, but thoughts on solid ground. He didn't need to get up. He didn't have to demand anything, because the world had already risen up for him. And in that instant, what began as a silent journey, now it was a global spectacle, not by the lights, but by the shadows that had finally been exposed. and there in front of the cabin. The flight attendant, who smiled disdainfully, was still smiling, but it was the last time he would smile like that. The first time the chief stewardess suspected something was wrong was when she saw the captain cross the cabin with a more tense face than usual. He rarely left the cockpit during the flight, even more so to approach her directly. Without beating around the bush, he asked her to accompany him to the aircraft service area, away from the eyes of the passengers. The tone of his voice was not aggressive, but it was loaded with authority. She went without contesting, still thinking it could be about some technical problem, some security adjustment. But what he heard there, he dismantled it from the inside. With the tablet in his hands, the captain showed the video that circulated on the networks. Then, he expanded the pinned comment. The image of Elijah, with his battered backpack and serene countenance, stamped, "The Canvas." His name was just below, in bold, with a verified seal. It was impossible to contest. The flight attendant was out of breath for a second. He tried to say something, but the words didn't come out. When he finally regained his speech, he could only stammer, I didn't know." The captain, firmly, replied with surgical coolness, "It doesn't change anything." The weight of truth fell on her like an avalanche. What started as debauchery was now a disaster. The posture of superiority slipped from his face, replaced by wide eyes and trembling breathing. She tried to remember what exactly she had said, how she acted, where the limits she had crossed were. But it was too late. Reality was recorded, posted, commented on, replicated, translated. The entire crew had failed before the man who wrote the guidelines of conduct that they were to follow. When she returned to the cabin, she was no longer the same. The steps that were once firm and noisy were now light and cautious. The rehearsed smiles disappeared. The other crew members, noticing the sudden change in behavior, began to whisper. One of them questioned her discreetly. "Did something happen?" She just shook her head, not having the courage to explain. Gradually, the rumor spread through the team. Something very serious was happening, and it involved the passenger of the 17B. Those who had mocked, ignored, or just followed the commissioners' toxic leadership were now baffled. Some began to ask questions. Others began to avoid eye contact with passengers. An awkward silence hung over the first-class cabin. The space that was once synonymous with exclusivity now looked like a courtroom, waiting for the verdict, and everyone knew that the sentence was already written. It just hadn't been pronounced. At the back of the plane, Elijah stood impassive. The movement around him increased, but he continued with the same calm countenance. The cell phone was still turned off. The posture is still upright. The silence is still absolute. He didn't need to get up. He didn't need to point fingers. The whole world had already seen it. And the most bitter irony for the crew was just this. The man they humiliated never had to say a word to destroy them. And as the aircraft prepared to land, a convoy of black cars was already lining the runway. And with them came justice in its most elegant form, silent, visible, and inevitable. The sound of the wheels touching the asphalt of the track sounded like the bursting of a seal of silence. The plane landed softly, but inside it, the atmosphere was leaden. The stewardesses no longer smiled. The flight attendants walked in slow motion, as if stepping on invisible shards. The chief stewardess did not even stand up. She remained seated at the rear of the aircraft, her eyes fixed on an undefined point. The captain, in silence, received instructions through the internal channel. The message was clear. No passenger disembarks until Mr. Elijah Monroe gets out first. Outside, the contrast was brutal. A convoy of black SUVs parked next to the landing stairs caught the attention of even the most distracted. Security guards, company directors, journalists, and TV cameras waited in silence. The control tower had already been informed. The terminal had cordoned off an area for the press. And quietly, the airport employees knew that arrival wasn't just the end of a flight, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that began with the most underrated man in that aircraft. Elijah stood up as calmly as always. He took his backpack, straightened his braids back, and walked down the corridor as if he were walking along a familiar road. He passed faces that had previously ignored him and now averted their eyes. No one dared to face him. No apology came. No, "I'm sorry, sir." But it wasn't necessary either. The silence of the culprits was already loud enough. When he arrived at the door of the aircraft, the flight attendant there just stepped back. There were no more orders, only respect, forced but present. As I stepped on the ground, the flashes began. But Elijah didn't stop. He walked straight to the small pulpit set up in front of the black cars. The directors followed him, some with their heads down, others with the forced posture of someone trying to remain professional. The microphone was already on. The press was silent. The world watched live. And then, in a low, firm, unhurried voice, Elijah said what everyone was waiting to hear. "Today I was not treated as an owner. I was treated like no one else. And that's exactly how many are treated every day, but without a camera. Unnamed, no defense." The silence after his words was absolute. The echo of each sentence seemed louder than the aircraft's own engines. He continued. He spoke of dignity, equality, and the shame of seeing his creation fail with the values he preached. He said he didn't want applause or tributes. He wanted change. And he ended with a phrase that made headlines in the same minute. "If they judge me by my clothes, imagine what they do to those who have nothing." The applause that came after was not rehearsed. It was genuine, mixed with tears, shame, and a collective feeling that a line had been crossed and corrected. As he left the pulpit, reporters still tried to follow him, but he discreetly got into one of the cars in the convoy. Inside, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if putting an end to a road too long. The door closed, and the vehicle drove off, leaving on the track not only the tire trail, but an exposed wound and a system that would never be the same again. On the aircraft, the passengers finally began to disembark, but everyone knew that who left last. He left with more than luggage. He left carrying guilt and the next piece of baggage to be evaluated. It would not pass through a conveyor belt, but as a consequence, the video of Elijah's speech did not need cuts, subtitles, or a soundtrack. In less than an hour, he had already crossed the country. It was shared by celebrities, activists, journalists, and even competitors in the airline industry. What was most impressive was not the eloquence, it was the simplicity. Elijah spoke as if he had suffered in silence for too long, as someone who carries on his shoulders the dignity of many who have never had a microphone. The image of him, with his battered backpack still on his back and his gaze fixed, went viral with a force that no marketing campaign could buy. He said he did not speak as a businessman, nor as a billionaire. He spoke as a citizen, as a truck driver, as a passenger, as a father, as someone who knew that on that day it was not only him who had been denied a place, it was the thousands of anonymous people who, every day, are chased away from the place where they should be welcomed. "They called me an intruder in my own house," he said, "but I remained standing, because this floor, I built it." The phrase became a mural, a t-shirt, a political speech. But above all, it has become a mirror. The public commotion was immediate. At the door of the company's headquarters, dozens of employees placed spontaneous apology letters. Many of them stated that even without directly participating in the case, they felt collective shame. In schools, teachers showed Elijah's video in class as an example of posture, truth, and courage. In companies, meetings were interrupted to discuss the impact of the case, and on the networks, a hashtag led the world trends. No Yolga Pelarupajam. It was the birth of a new movement. Elijah, however, refused interviews. He remained silent. He made it clear that he would not turn his pain into a spectacle. He wanted impact, not ibope. His only public gesture after the speech was to authorize the company to publish an excerpt from his personal diary, a simple handwritten page with a solitary sentence. "You know who you are. Don't let the gaze of others rewrite your truth." The publication broke records. But more than likes, it generated reflection. The company's board of directors was pressured from all sides. Shareholders wanted explanations. Politicians asked for formal clarifications. Customers threatened boycott. And then came the answer. A statement by the new interim president broadcast live. She began her speech by saying that Elijah hadn't lost control of the company. He just never liked being in the spotlight. And he said, "Today, we are not going to protect reputations. Let's protect values." The audience listened, and he applauded. The same speech, the company announced a cultural reconstruction plan, mandatory training of all staff, behavioral auditing in all sectors, and immediate dismissal of the flight attendant and supervisor involved. But it didn't stop there. The company would also allocate part of the annual profit to an anti-discrimination education fund, and the name of the new program would be symbolic, Project 17B, in the name of those who were forgotten. The place where Elijah was demoted, now it became a symbol of memory. But Elijah was not watching the talk from the meeting room or from the front row. He saw him from the cab of his truck, stopped at a roadside station, where he felt most at home, where no one needed a suit to be respected, where silence was still the best way to teach, and right there, surrounded by tires, dust, and diesel. He knew that that day he had lifted much more than a flight. He had raised consciences. The company's response was not just words. In less than 48 hours after Elijah's speech, the reformulation began. The first attitude was symbolic and immediate. The dismissal of the 2 employees who carried out the humiliation. No letter of recommendation, no tribute to the outset. Without institutional silence. But the most powerful gesture came next. The interim CEO announced that the company's culture would undergo a thorough intervention, led by outside experts. For the first time, the structure of an aviation giant would bend to humility. All of the company's units, from check-ins to administrative offices, began to be repainted with a new motto on the walls. You are serving a human being, not a status. In addition, an anonymous reporting channel was created for customers and employees to report any form of prejudice or inequality in service. The passenger boarding protocol was rewritten from scratch. Monthly training became mandatory, with real simulations of discrimination scenarios, and the punishments for violations would be severe. Elijah refused positions, medals, and commendations. He said that his mission was not to promote himself, but to make sure that no one else went through what he went through. And he asked for only one thing, that the company's attendants be forced to watch, at least once a month, the video of the humiliation and the discourse, not to generate fear, but to remember, to never forget, because what hurts teaches, and what teaches transforms. His request was accepted, and the video was officially incorporated into the new employee training module. The repercussion crossed borders. Other airlines have begun to review their own processes. An international seminar was organized to discuss inclusive practices in the transport sector. And for the first time, a former black truck driver, soft-spoken and with a firm gaze, was invited to open the event. Elijah took the stage wearing jeans, a plaid shirt, and boots. He refused the suit, and he began his speech with a sentence that stopped the room. First class doesn't start at the seat, it starts with the look. In universities, theses were written about the case. Academic articles debated the social impact of the episode. Sociologists called it the flight that turned into a mirror. Companies from other branches followed suit and launched internal campaigns focused on humanity, not appearance. What started with a rejected backpack and a torn note. Now he was sowing structural changes in organizations around the world. And Elijah, always silent, watched it all happen with the serenity of someone who knows that time sometimes needs a push. Meanwhile, seat 17B was removed from the plane, literally. It became a museum piece inside the company's new training center, under a glass dome. Next to it, a steel plate read, "In this seat a man was humiliated." And from that seat, a new standard of respect was born. But what would come next? It wasn't about companies. It was about legacy. and this is only built with what cannot be bought. Months had passed since the incident on the flight. The world turned as usual, but in some companies, in some airports, in some people, something had changed. It wasn't the uniform, nor the protocol, it was the look, the way of listening, care when attending, and above all, the humility and understanding that behind each face there is a story that cannot be seen. Elijah Monroe never wore first class again, not out of hurt, but by choice. He said that the best view of the flight has always been from the economy window, where humanity is most visible. He also did not return to the presidency of the company. He was still the name behind everything, yes, but he preferred the seat of the truck, the road stations, the small meetings with ordinary people. He was seen offering a ride to a student in the countryside, talking to attendants at a simple counter, sitting with children in social projects that he supported anonymously. And whenever someone recognized him and asked, "Why do you still live like this?" he replied with the same calmness, "Because it was here that I learned the value that others forgot." Elijah's story became a book. It became a documentary. It became a campaign theme. But for him, the greatest legacy was in the invisible. It was in the consciousness that now accompanied those who had previously judged. I was in the doubt that arose in whom before I pointed out with such certainty. The real impact was not in the spotlight. It was between the lines, in the smiles that became sincere, in the notes that were no longer questioned, in the passengers who were now seen and not just verified. In public schools, the name Elijah Monroe was given to libraries, reading rooms, and auditoriums. In forgotten communities, young people repeated his phrases like mantras. In companies, the Elijah moment became an exercise. Every time someone doubted someone about their appearance, another employee had to ask, "Are you sure you know who you're talking to?" Not for fear of authority, but out of respect for history. One morning, next to his old truck, Elijah handed an envelope to the company's new president. Inside, there was a symbolic note, "First class, in your name." Next to it, a letter. "This ticket is worth nothing if it is not valid for everyone. Take care of the company, take care of people, because when dignity flies high, no one needs to fall." The note was framed and placed in the main lobby of the headquarters. Under it, a phrase cut in wood. "Respect is the only luxury that cannot be bought, but it is what enriches those who offer it the most." And so, Elijah Monroe got back on the road from where he never left, because deep down he knew it is there among curves and dust that the truest paths are built. There are people who think that power is recognized by the watch on the wrist, by the brand of the shoe, or by the surname he carries. But true power is silent. He doesn't need to prove anything, because he knows who he is, even when the world tries to tell him otherwise. Elijah Monroe was just another trucker for those who judged him, but for those who listened with their hearts, he was much more. He was the living reminder that dignity cannot be bought, and that respect is not negotiable. He didn't humiliate anyone. He exposed a system. And he did it with the calm of someone who built an empire, driving along the banks that everyone ignored. And do you know why? Because there are roads that only the soul of a righteous person can travel. If this story moved you, do two things. Now, share it with someone who has been judged for what they wore, and say, "This is for you." Comment below. Respect is not measured by clothes. Because if thousands comment on this, maybe the next flight attendant will think twice before judging a face and without knowing the story. And remember, a note can be torn, but a lesson like this is never forgotten.